The sound of the suitcase zipper snapped me out of my thoughts. I glanced up from the breakfast table just as he was zipping up the last pocket. His back turned to me. The coffee in my mug had long gone cold, but I didn't care. I had been too preoccupied with the stillness of the morning, with the way the air felt unusually heavy, as though something was about to shift. "Don't forget your charger," I called, more out of habit than genuine concern. He always remembered his charger. He always remembered everything. "I packed it already," he replied without looking back, his tone brisk but familiar. I wanted to ask him if he really had to leave this time. It wasn't the first Saturday morning like this, nor would it be the last. His work demanded his absence, and over the years, I had learned to make peace with the quiet weekends his business trips left behind. But today felt different. I couldn't explain why, and I doubted he'd understand even if I tried. So instead, I stood up, walked to the door, and hugged him lightly before he could step outside. "Be safe," I murmured. He nodded, kissed my forehead, and was gone. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the hallway, followed by the faint hum of his car engine disappearing down the driveway. And then there was silence. I sighed, running a hand through my hair, and turned back toward the kitchen. The sun had fully risen now, filling the room with soft golden light. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, almost louder than usual. I had the whole day ahead of me, just like every other time he left. There was a strange comfort in the predictability of it all. With a deep breath, I grabbed the cleaning supplies from under the sink. It was my usual routine, a way to fill the hours and keep my thoughts from wandering too far. The house had its own rhythm, and I had learned to follow it. Room by room, I set things in order, finding solace in the simple, repetitive motions. By mid-morning, I had made my way to the living room, a cozy space filled with neutral tones and soft fabrics. Sunlight spilled in through the large bay window, highlighting the faint dust particles that danced in the air. I adjusted the throw pillows, wiped down the coffee table, and picked up a stray magazine. As I moved to vacuum the rug, a sudden creak from the front door broke my concentration. I froze. My heart gave a small jolt, and for a second, I thought my husband might have forgotten something and come back. But no, he always called first. I set the vacuum down and slowly approached the door. Standing in the doorway was my husband's son, his figure partially silhouetted against the late morning light. For a moment, neither of us said anything. His key dangled loosely from his hand, as if he had debated whether or not to use it. "Oh!" I exclaimed, a nervous laugh escaping before I could stop it. "You scared me. I didn't hear you come in." He smiled faintly, a shadow of the boyish grin I remembered, but there was something unfamiliar about it now. Something I couldn't quite place. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and tucked his hands into the pockets of his jacket. "Sorry," he said, his voice quieter than I remembered. "Didn't mean to startle you." "No harm done," I replied, brushing off the moment with a smile. "It's just, I wasn't expecting you this weekend. I decided to come home," he said simply, shrugging. "Dad mentioned he'd be away, so I thought I'd keep you company." There was nothing inherently strange about his words, but I felt a flicker of something in the air between us. Something subtle but undeniable. Shaking it off, I gestured toward the kitchen. I was about to make tea. "Want some?" He nodded, following me. The kitchen felt smaller with him in it, though I knew that wasn't true. As I boiled the water and gathered mugs, we exchanged pleasantries. He spoke about school, his professors, and the city where he lived. I listened, nodding in the right places, but my focus kept drifting to the way he leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his gaze steady and unwavering. He had changed since the last time I saw him. It wasn't just his voice, which had deepened, or the way he carried himself, with a quiet confidence that bordered on intensity. It was in his eyes. There was something there that hadn't been before. "Did your dad tell you he'd be gone for the weekend?" I asked, handing him a mug of tea. He nodded. "Yeah. He mentioned it last time we talked." We settled at the table, and for a while, the conversation flowed more naturally. He asked about the house, my work, and even teased me about my devotion to the weekly cleaning routine. I laughed, relaxing slightly, but the unease lingered at the edges of my mind. As the day wore on, he followed me as I moved from room to room, tidying up and rearranging things. At first, It felt nice to have company. But then I started to notice how quiet he was, how his gaze seemed to linger just a little too long when he thought I wasn't looking. In the soft light of the afternoon, the house began to feel different. The familiar rhythm faltered, replaced by a faint but persistent hum of tension that I couldn't quite explain. By the time I finished cleaning, I was more exhausted than usual. I told myself it was just the surprise of having him home, the adjustment to sharing my space after expecting solitude. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. I just didn't know what. As I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching him lean against the counter, I felt a strange awareness settle over me, a prickling sensation that I couldn't shake. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something else entirely. The sound of footsteps following me from room to room became a quiet rhythm, almost like background noise. It wasn't intrusive, but it was persistent, like a faint shadow trailing behind. I told myself it was nice, having company during these mundane tasks, but I couldn't ignore the subtle tension hanging in the air. The kind you don't notice right away but feel later, like a weight on your chest. We had moved to the living room, and I was straightening the books on the shelf, organizing them by height. He stood a few feet away, watching. I caught his reflection in the glass of the cabinet door, and for a moment, our eyes met. He didn't look away, and I quickly busied myself with a stack of magazines. "You always keep everything so neat," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Old habits," I replied, forcing a light tone. "Your dad teases me about it all the time." He smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I think it's nice. Comfortable." The compliment caught me off guard. I turned to look at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Thanks," I said quietly, feeling an odd warmth in my chest. I quickly dismissed it, picking up a stray coaster from the coffee table and placing it back in its holder. As I worked, he asked me questions. Simple ones, about how I spent my days, what I liked to cook, whether I ever missed living in the city. At first, I answered without thinking, happy to fill the silence. But then I started noticing the way he listened. Not passively, like most people, but fully, as if my every word mattered. It was unsettling in a way I couldn't put into words. By the time I moved to the kitchen, the feeling had grown stronger. I focused on wiping down the counters, hoping the mindless task would clear my head. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his posture relaxed but his gaze intent. "Do you ever get lonely?" he asked suddenly. I froze for half a second, then forced myself to keep cleaning. "What do you mean?" "When Dad's gone," he clarified. "Does it ever feel too quiet?" I hesitated. It was an innocent enough question, but there was something in the way he asked it that made me pause. "Not really," I lied. "I like the quiet. It gives me time to catch up on things." He nodded, but his expression was unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged, until I finally couldn't stand it anymore. "Why did you decide to come home this weekend?" I asked, turning to face him. He shrugged, but his eyes didn't waver. "Just felt like it." His answer was simple, almost dismissive, but it didn't sit right with me. There was more to it, there had to be, but I didn't push. Instead, I turned back to the counter, scrubbing at a spot that didn't need cleaning. "You don't have to hover, you know," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "I'm not that exciting." "I don't mind," he replied, his tone soft but firm. I glanced over my shoulder, meeting his gaze again. There it was, that same intensity I'd noticed earlier. It wasn't aggressive or inappropriate, but it was focused. As if he saw something in me I didn't see in myself. I turned away quickly, my cheeks warm. "You must be bored out of your mind," I said with a laugh, hoping to break the tension. "Not really," he said, his voice low. "It's nice being here." There was nothing inherently wrong with his words, but the way he said them made my pulse quicken. I needed to change the subject, to do something that would shift the mood. "Why don't you help me with dinner?" I suggested, forcing a cheerful tone. "If you're going to hang around, you might as well make yourself useful." He smiled, a genuine one this time, and the tension eased slightly. "Sure. What are we making?" "Something simple," I said, opening the fridge. "Maybe pasta?" He nodded, moving to stand beside me at the counter. I handed him a cutting board and a knife. giving him the task of chopping vegetables while I boiled water. For a while, the kitchen was filled with the comforting sounds of cooking. The rhythmic chopping of the knife, the soft bubbling of the water, the hum of the overhead fan. But even as we worked side by side, the awareness of his presence never left me. It was in the small details. The way his arm brushed mine when we reached for the same utensil, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the task at hand, but it was like trying to ignore the weight of a heavy blanket draped over my shoulders. When dinner was finally ready, we sat across from each other at the small kitchen table. The food was good, simple but satisfying, and the conversation flowed more easily now. We talked about his classes, his plans for the future, even a funny story about his roommate. For a little while, it felt normal, comfortable. But as the meal came to an end and the plate sat empty between us, the silence returned. It wasn't the peaceful kind that comes with contentment, it was the kind that feels loaded, like it's waiting for someone to speak first. He was the one to break it. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." His tone was quiet but steady, and my heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. I want you to know how much I admire you. How much you've done for Dad. For all of us." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "That means a lot." He nodded, but his gaze didn't falter. "You're really important to me. More than you probably realize." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. I forced myself to smile, to brush it off. "That's sweet of you to say. But you should probably save that kind of talk for your dad." He smiled faintly, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. "Maybe." And just like that, the moment passed. He stood, taking his plate to the sink, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The evening wasn't over yet, but I already felt like I had lived a lifetime in the span of a single day. The sound of running water filled the kitchen as I stood at the sink, rinsing the dishes from dinner. I tried to focus on the warmth of the soapy water against my hands, the familiar rhythm of cleaning, anything to drown out the strange unease still lingering in the air. The events of the day replayed in my mind, but I pushed them aside, convincing myself it was nothing. Just a moment of awkwardness, I told myself. Tomorrow, it would all feel distant, even silly. Behind me, the house was silent. Too silent. He had disappeared into the living room, or so I assumed. I wanted to check, to reassure myself that everything was fine, but I resisted. It would only make things worse, stirring the pot when all I wanted was for it to settle. I dried my hands and turned off the faucet. The soft hum of the fridge seemed unnaturally loud as I stood there, staring at the sink. I needed to move, to do something, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. I hadn't realized how tightly wound I'd become until I heard the quiet shuffle of footsteps behind me. "Hi," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned, startled, and saw him standing in the doorway. His posture was hesitant, his hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie. He looked younger like this, almost like the boy I remembered when I first met him, years ago, before life and distance had changed him. "Hi," I replied, my voice equally soft. "You scared me." "Sorry," he said quickly, stepping into the kitchen. "I didn't mean to." He trailed off, as if searching for the right words. I leaned against the counter, folding my arms across my chest. "What is it?" I asked, trying to sound casual, even though my pulse quickened with every passing second. He hesitated, his gaze flickering between me and the floor. "I wanted to apologize. For earlier." "There's nothing to apologize for," I said, forcing a reassuring smile. "You didn't do anything wrong." He looked up then, his eyes locking onto mine. "I made things weird, didn't I?" The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to reply, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself shaking my head, as if that simple gesture could erase the tension between us. "You didn't," I said finally. "It's just been a long day." He nodded, stepping closer. "I just don't want you to think I was being disrespectful. I wasn't trying to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," I repeated, though the words felt hollow. "Let's just forget about it," okay? His eyes softened, but he didn't move away. I wish I could, he said quietly. Forget about it, I mean. But I can't. I felt my breath hitch, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. I wanted to look away, to break the moment, but I couldn't. There was something in his gaze, something raw and vulnerable, that held me in place. You're just going through a lot right now, I said, trying to keep my tone steady. It's normal to feel a little confused. He shook his head, his expression firm. I'm not confused. I know how I feel. I've known for a long time. The room seemed to shrink around us, the space between us filled with an unbearable tension. I took a step back, gripping the edge of the counter for support. This isn't. You can't feel that way, I said, my voice faltering. It's not right. Why not? He asked, his voice low but steady. Because it's not what people expect? Because it makes things complicated? Because it's not fair, I said, cutting him off. To you. To your dad. To anyone. For a moment, he didn't respond. His shoulders slumped slightly, and he looked down at the floor. I just wanted you to know, he said finally. I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat refusing to go away. Well, now I know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But nothing can come of it. You understand that, right? He nodded slowly, but his eyes were still fixed on me. I understand, he said. But that doesn't make it any easier. The honesty in his voice cut through me, leaving me speechless. I wanted to say something, anything that would ease the tension, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, we stood there in silence, the weight of everything left unsaid pressing down on us. Finally, he took a step back, his hands slipping out of his pockets. I'm sorry, he said again, his voice barely audible. For everything. Before I could respond, he turned and walked out of the kitchen. The sound of his footsteps faded as he disappeared down the hallway, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sank onto one of the kitchen chairs, my hands trembling as I stared at the empty doorway. The house felt impossibly quiet now, the kind of quiet that felt more like a void than a comfort. I tried to tell myself that it was over, that things would go back to normal, but I knew better. Something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. For the rest of the evening, I moved through the house in a daze, going through the motions of my usual routine but not really present. I folded laundry, straightened the cushions on the couch, and double-checked that the front door was locked, but it all felt meaningless. My mind was elsewhere, replaying every word, every glance, every unspoken moment between us. When I finally climbed into bed that night, the weight of the day pressed down on me like a stone. I stared at the ceiling, the faint hum of the heater the only sound in the room. I told myself that things would get better, that this was just a passing storm. But deep down, I knew the truth. Some storms don't pass. They leave marks, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once you know where to look. And tonight, I could feel those marks taking shape, carving themselves into the fabric of my life, leaving me to wonder if things would ever truly be the same again.